Hi, everybody. So we are going to be discussing the reading number 4, which is Studies in the Mentality of Literates, Searching for the Cultural Great Divide at the Individual Level of Analysis by Auro Tomla. This is reading 4 in the reading 4 in the Culture, Language, and Learning course. As always, I will attempt to get through the paper with commentary, and then I will try to make some commentary on the paper after in another video. In case anybody hasn't looked out the window, it is a beautiful snowy day here in Tallinn. Okay, let's begin. The problem, the form of the cultural evolution. With this paper, I aim at understanding better why qualitative stages in cultural development should be distinguished, and what is the essence of these qualitative leaps. I also provide arguments to support the idea that cultural development can be studied also at the individual level of analysis. I think all scholars would agree that human culture has changed in time. Cultural humans have lived in groups with little or no contact with other groups over long periods of time. These relatively isolated groups developed into different cultures so that today social groups with different cultures can be distinguished. I think all scholars would also agree that each of these cultures has changed in time. Furthermore, I suppose most, if not all, scholars would also agree that cultures did not just change in time, cultures have evolved or developed. From this point forward, the opinions of scholars become different. Many believed that cultural evolution has proceeded over a fixed sequence of steps. Lewis H. Morgan, for example, suggested, quotation, "It can now be asserted upon convincing evidence that savagery preceded barbarism in all the tribes of mankind, as barbarism is known to have preceded civilization. The history of the human race is one in source, one in experience, one in progress." Morgan, 1877. It did not follow for him, however, that all human societies passed through these stages at the same speed. On the contrary, some achieved civilization where others did not yet. Quotation, "It may be further observed that the domestic institutions of the barbarous and even of the savage ancestors of mankind are still exemplified in portions of the human family with such completeness that, with the exception of the strictly primitive period, the several stages of this progress are tolerably well preserved. The theory of human degradation to explain the existence of savages and barbarians is no longer tenable." End quote. It will be important in the following discussion that for Morgan, the status of civilization commenced with the use of a phonetic alphabet and the production of literary records. Many other scholars have essentially agreed that cultural evolution proceeds over the same line of stages. At the same time, not all cultures proceed through these stages with the same speeds. Therefore, more developed cultures exist in parallel with less developed cultures. Opposite view on cultural evolution emerged also. Frank Boas, for example, did not agree with the idea of universal developmental lines of all cultures. Quote, "First of all, the history of the human civilization does not appear to us as determined entirely by psychological necessity that leads to a uniform evolution the world over. We rather see that each cultural group has its own unique history, dependent partly upon the peculiar inner development of the social group, and partly upon the foreign influences to which it has been subjected." Boas, 1920. Boas was a cultural relativist. Civilization is not something absolute, but that it is relative and that our ideas and concepts are true only so far as our civilization goes. Boas, 1887. Cultural relativism is directly related to another important concept, that of ethnocentrism. the view according to which one's own group is the center of everything, and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. Acceptance of the cultural relativist position rejects ethnocentrism because no culture can be understood from the position of another culture. Therefore, there is no way to arrange cultures into hierarchical order of development, as such arrangement is possible only from the outsider's viewpoint. Small detour. What is psychic or cultural development? To understand Vygotsky's theory, I am partly relying upon to understand the theory of Vygotsky. I am rephrasing because this sentence is inelegant. To understand the theory of Vygotsky that I am relying upon in this paper, and the theory developed in this paper that goes beyond the theories I am aware of, it is important to understand what is development. I think all theories that deny hierarchical differences between cultures have to define development as a quantitative growth of the content of culture. If all cultures are at the same level of development, then cultural differences emerge not from differences in the way of thinking, but from differences in the environment where the development takes place, and with which members of a culture interact. Thus, cultures differ in the amount of cultural content that is specific to their cultural practices. For Vygotsky, accumulation of the cultural content that is different in content but similar in psychic form would not be development in his theory. Vygotsky wrote, quote, "The development of the child is a process of becoming or emergence of the person, the human personality which takes place in uninterrupted emergence of novel characteristics, novel qualities, novel proprieties, novel formations that are prepared with the whole preceding course of development, but have not been contained in the ready-made form, only in smaller and modest measure at the earlier steps of development." So development implies the emergence of novel forms that do not exist in the ready-made form from the beginning of the development. These novel forms at the same time are not added independently to the previous developed forms, but rather emerge from synthesis of earlier, simpler forms. Thus, development is necessarily hierarchical. Later forms may emerge only after achieving the earlier forms. More generally, I think development is a hierarchical reorganization of a structure. Important consequences follow from this understanding of development. If truly novel forms emerge in the process of psychic and cultural development, and this emergence is hierarchical, that is, it requires necessarily earlier states of development where that form did not exist at all, then neither children nor cultures can be all at the same level or stage of development. I suppose in the case of children, this fact is more obvious, unless we assume that development is nothing but a quantitative growth. Children are qualitatively different from adults, and not just different, but less developed. There are two reasons for that. First, development takes time, and second, development is directly dependent on the possibility to experience different kinds of environments. All content of psyche is about environment in its diversity, and each of the different kinds of environment has to be experienced. Experiencing different environment takes, again, time, but also possibilities to encounter them. Furthermore, if development is hierarchical, then the developmental environment must be ordered in time also, in correspondence with the developmental level of the individual. For example, there is a reason why formal schooling begins at the age of 7 and not from the age of, say, 7 days. School environment cannot be experienced appropriately before a child has developed to a certain level. The same actually must apply to cultures. Together with the development of the complexity of the individual minds in a social group, a culture, complexity of human environment also increases. More developed individuals create more complex environments, formal schools among them. These more complex environments in turn provide possibilities for other individuals to develop. Cultures that are not in contact with one another can develop only the basis of internal resources, on the basis of the development of individuals from one and the same culture. Even today, relatively isolated cultures still exist. A few centuries ago, cultural isolation was a rule rather than the exception. Cultures that develop on the basis of internal resources are not going to develop at exactly the same pace, so developmental differences between cultures had to emerge in the history of humankind. Searching for the Great Divide. Literacy. The Great Divide? Question mark. Scholars who supported the lineal cultural evolution idea have searched for cultural achievements that would universally define certain specific direction of subsequent to it cultural evolution. Scholars have been looking for a single breaking point, a great divide, that could be related to the emergence of more advanced form of a society. Lewis H. Morgan, as I mentioned above, related the beginning of civilization to the emergence of phonetic alphabet. Invention of a phonetic alphabet has been one of the most plausible candidates for a great divide. Indeed, it has been suggested by several scholars that the invention of alphabetic script opens a way to subsequent reorganization of the society from primitive savage into modern civilized. Myths give place to history, logic emerges, political democracy develops in a society, and actually the whole organization of society changes together with individuals who develop novel ways to relate to the world. How does this account for the Great Bronze Age collapse? Not going to comment, not going to comment. Two quotes I put at the beginning of this paper express the opposite attitude towards writing. Perhaps learning to write would help to live an easy life, as an Egyptian father suggested to his son. Plato, however, has a much less enthusiastic about the benefits of writing. There are many scholars today who also question whether writing is as important as it is suggested to be, and whether literacy has only positive consequences. In fact, there is good ground to suggest that consequences of literacy depend on the ways literacy is used. It matters what is written and what is read. Literacy can be used as a tool in establishing power relations in a society, sometimes for ethnocentric or Eurocentric perspective. Indeed, introduction of universal literacy has more often been motivated by religious, nationalistic, and economic goals rather than by an aim to improve man's situation. From literacy to formal education or schooling. In addition to ideological political postmodernist and similar speculative talk against centrism and oppositions that grounds large parts of discussions where the idea of the Great Divide and the role of literacy in it is rejected. Also, empirical evidence began to accumulate showing that learning literacy does not necessarily have consequences that were expected by those who suggested that literacy grounds the Great Divide. Before going further, there is one point that must be made explicit. Goody and many other scholars related the emergence of literacy to changes of a society or culture as a whole. The evidence that contradicts this proposition came from the studies of literate and non-literate individuals. I think it is important that individual level of analysis and collective society level of analysis are ways to conceptualize essentially the same psychosocial phenomena in this case. Proof, please. Sorry. Society cannot be literate unless individuals who compose the society are literate. And if individuals in a social group are literate, the whole group is also literate. It does not follow that all individuals in a literate society have to be literate. Let me just read that again. Society cannot be literate unless the individuals who comprise the society are literate. And if individuals in a social group are literate, the whole group is also literate. It does not follow that all individuals in a literate society have to be literate. Um, if they are a member of that social group in that literate society, you have just said that they're not going to comment. Literacy has to be learned by each and every individual, and different individuals do not become literate at the same time. So literate societies are heterogeneous at the individual level of analysis. Some are literate, whereas others, like children or adults who for different reasons did not have access to the environment where literacy can be learned, are not. The same applies to all other characteristics of a society that can be anti-democrats in democratic societies, anti-capitalists in capitalist societies, etc. However, it would be impossible a society to be democratic without some individuals being democratic in that society. Furthermore, with the exception of a very few individuals who have invented writing systems, individuals become literate through learning from those who are already literate. So studies at the individual level of analysis can refute theories at the societal level of analysis and vice versa. Silver, Scribner, and Michael Cole provide evidence that seems to demonstrate that emergence of literacy is not related to profound changes in other aspects of individual cognition, and therefore emergence of literacy in a society is not the ground of fundamental organization of it. They studied the Vai people of Liberia, who had invented their own phonetic writing system, and who usually acquired literacy outside of school. A battery of psychological cognitive tests was presented to illiterates, literates who had not attended school, and literates who had attended school. With a few exceptions of secondary importance, those who attended school outperformed other two groups. Thus, Scribner and Cole suggested that literacy does not have an effect on thought processes as such. It is the social practices related to informed schooling that leads to cognitive consequences. Such results of studies supposedly demonstrate wrong. In this paper, I'm going to suggest, following Vygotsky's theory, but going beyond it, that development of mind proceeds over a series of hierarchical stages, and neither individuals nor cultures develop in a coordinated manner that would guarantee that the same stages are achieved at the same time. For this reason, human cultures as well as individuals are developmentally different. Some are more developed than others. Among other ideas, Vygotsky has also suggested that grammar and writing can support the development of a higher stage of what he calls scientific concepts. I prefer to call concepts of this type logical or scientific concepts. Concepts may have no relation to science, but such concepts ground the development of formal logical thought. When Scribner and Cole's book was published in 1981, only two translations of Vygotsky's work with highly questionable quality were available in English. So it was possible that Scribner and Cole relied on texts where Vygotsky's ideas were distorted. Cole, however, suggested that the results of Vaya studies contradict Vygotsky's theory many years after considerably less problematic translations of most Vygotsky's works were published. So, quote, given the claims Vygotsky made for literacy, Vygotsky clearly was wrong about the consequences of writing for the thought process. He confused the cultural practices of his time and place, where literacy and schooling were tightly combined, for those that obtain across history more generally, such that literacy and schooling were virtually synonymous. The same can be said of Lura and Brunner. Cole, 2006. If Vygotsky was wrong in this important point, that is also relevant for the theory developed below. then relying on his theory should be questionable, if not simply wrong. I think that actual results of the VIA study cannot ground such a conclusion. First, it is important that the idea of hierarchical development implies sequence. Some development changes must be achieved before the next stage becomes possible. It does not follow, however, that achievement that is necessary for the higher stage of development to become possible is also sufficient. To prove that literacy is not necessary for the development of logical concepts, double dissociation must be found. Literacy cannot exist without logical concepts. This was found by Scrivener and Cole indeed, and logical concepts can develop without literacy. The latter was not demonstrated in the VIA study. On the contrary, what was demonstrated was that individuals who outperformed other people in cognitive tests usually associated with the development of literacy were both schooled and literate. Even if Vygotsky's position would have been presented correctly, VIA study could not prove that Vygotsky was wrong. Second, and more importantly, Vygotsky did not hold the position criticized by Cole in the quotation above. Cole refers to Vygotsky Thinking and Speech, published in English in 1987. In the same text, Cole also provides several passages from the same source, not from the 1962 Thought and Language translated by Halfman and Vakar. The difference is important because in the 1962 version, important parts of Vygotsky's original book were not provided. Originally, Vygotsky wrote, "Written speech is also not a simple translation of oral speech into written signs, and mastering written speech is not simply acquisition of techniques of writing. Written speech is absolutely special function of speech, being distinct from oral speech, not less than internal speech is distinct from external by its structure and mode of functioning." Not identical, but sufficiently similar in content, expression of the same ideas are published in the more recent English versions, referred to by Cole. So before declaring Vygotsky to be wrong, it should have been demonstrated that written speech in Vygotsky terms was used by VI people. It should have been made clear that VI people did not just translate oral speech into written signs. Actually, exactly the latter seem to characterize literate but not schooled VI people. Excuse me, I just need to plug in my headset. Furthermore, Vygotsky did not suggest that development of writing necessarily leads to the development of scientific logical concepts. He was absolutely clear here too. Quote, "Thus, both grammar and writing provide the child with the potential of moving to a higher level in speech development." In fact, this idea can be found in the 1962 translation. Grammar and writing help the child to rise to a higher level of speech development. There is more evidence to demonstrate that Vygotsky did not suggest that literacy makes the next development stage emerge. In another work, The History of Development of Higher Psychic Functions, he also discussed the emergence of literacy in children. From this chapter, it is clear that Vygotsky not only was aware that writing can be learned before the school age, he actually suggested that teaching to write should begin before going to school at the age of about 4 to 5 years, even though it is not the age when written speech could develop. The latter begins to develop not before the age of 6 and more likely even 8 years. This work and also this particular idea was known to Cole. If writing could be learned before school, then scientific logical concepts begin to develop only at school, partly supported by the transformation of writing into written speech. Thus, again, if writing can develop years before scientific logical concepts, the acquisition of writing must be necessary, but certainly is not sufficient for the development of logical concepts. So what Vygotsky actually was discussing in his work was not the idea that literacy necessarily guarantees the development of the novel forms of thought operations. He was discussing the process of the emergence of those novel forms. In the hierarchical development of the mind, the higher order forms emerge on the basis of the earlier forms, so development of writing can be a precursor for the development of written speech and logical concepts. Such speech development is similar in that respect. It begins to differentiate before the emergence of the semiotically mediated higher psychic functions already in the system of purely natural forms of behavior. In the context of the present discussions, it can be conjectured that the Great Divide is not defined with the emergence of literacy, as numerous studies seem to confirm. It is school or formal education that is related to the change of individual minds. Yet this conclusion would also be incorrect. The problem is that there can be no unidirectional developmental environment, arrow mental change relationship. So developmental environment, arrow leading to mental change relationship. Formal education system is an example of the specifically organized developmental environment. Certain individuals actively participating in such an environment can develop higher forms of thought, which development is supported by teaching. Yet formal education system did not emerge together with the humankind. It was created much later. The very first teachers who created the structure of the environment that supports the development of logical concepts could not themselves develop this form of thinking at school. Logical concepts had to develop individually before those who already could think with logical concepts introduced this form of thought to school. In that sense, everything cultural has to emerge individually first. Only after numerous cumulative individual discoveries are made can ground first the emergence and then the development of culture. Okay. Therefore, the Great Divide should be defined in terms of the individual psyche rather than in terms of a society or culture. Yet individuals develop only in the process of interaction with the environment, and the results of the individual development is constrained by the kind of organization and of the environment. In differential organized environments, different knowledge may develop. Schooling is one form of specially organized environments. Education, in a general sense, is a process in which continuity of experience over generations emerges. With the renewal of physical existence goes, in the case of human beings, the recreation of beliefs, ideas, hopes, happiness, misery, and practices. The continuity of experience through renewal of social group is a literal fact. Education, in its broadest sense, is the means of this social continuity of life. Dewey, 1916. According to Dewey, education does not necessarily require a teacher. There is also incidental learning that takes place in the educative process of the communication in social groups. The very process of living together educates. So when Cole and the followers relate mental changes to education, they are talking not about any kind of education, but organized system of teaching, schooling, any kind of education, but the organized system of teaching, namely schooling. Also deliberate or formal education in Dewey's terms. Interestingly, for Dewey, formal schooling was not just another form of cultural practice. He suggested that undeveloped social groups do not organize formal teaching. In such savage groups, there are no special materials of institutions for teaching. Education takes place in the process of common activities. To savages, it would seem preposterous to seek out a place where nothing but learning was going on in order that one might learn. Dewey, 1916. The reason why schools are created lies in the fact that societies develop. But as civilization advances, the gap between the capacities of the young and the concerns of the adult widens. Learning by direct sharing of pursuits of the grown-ups becomes increasingly difficult, except in the case of the less advanced occupations. Much of what adults do is so remote in space and in meaning that playful imitation is less and less adequate to reproduce its spirit. Intentional agencies, schools, and explicit material studies are devised, but in an advanced culture, much which has to be learned is stored in symbols. It is far from translation into familiar acts and objects. Dewey, 1916. So first, schooling emerges in more advanced cultures. Schooling emerges because observational percipitory learning becomes insufficient for understanding the world of adults. This in turn is caused by the fact that advanced cultures rely also on knowledge stored in symbols. This knowledge is remote in space and in meaning. The latter point is important. A lot of knowledge is stored in symbols, also in less advanced cultures, but it can be translated into familiar acts and objects. Thus, Dewey's position seems to be that in more advanced cultures, the relation between language or symbols and the world is different from that of less advanced cultures. It is not only the content, the amount of knowledge, but also a different way on how the word is interpreted with language that grounds the emergence of formal education system. The Great Divide, word meaning structure. So Dewey essentially suggests that schooling as a specially organized learning environment emerges when a civilization or culture develops a more complex and remote form of everyday life forms of symbiotic knowledge must be acquired by children in order to adjust to the adult world. Thus, it can be hypothesized that the form of knowledge develops hierarchically, and schooling emerges when hierarchically more advanced forms of knowledge must be learned by next generations. Next, I'm going to elaborate this idea. All purposeful behavior is based on individual abilities to make sense of the environment as related to the organism and to plan actions according to how the environment-individual relationship is interpreted. All living organisms can anticipate potentially harmful to the organism, states of the environment and act in ways to avoid the harmful effects. Anakin, Konstantin, and Tomlin. The ability to anticipate future states of the environment and act accordingly can be based either on inherited mechanisms that emerged on the basis of the experience of the species or on the basis of the individual experiences. The latter ability defines psyche or mind. The psyche is a specifically organized form of living matter. It is purposefully behavior in anticipating environmental changes that are harmful for itself as a whole, is based on individual experience. Individual experience can be organized in different ways. It was Vygotsky who distinguished lower or natural psychic functions from higher psychic functions. Higher psychic or psychological functions are, according to Vygotsky, 1. Psychological systems. 2. Developing from natural processes. 3. Mediated by symbols. 4. Forms of psychological cooperation, which are 5. Internalized in the course of development. 6. Products of historical development. 7. Conscious. And 8. Voluntary. 9. Active forms of adaptation to the environment. 10. Dynamically changing in development. And 11. Ontogeny of higher psychic functions recapitulates cultural history. The most important distinguishing characteristics of the higher psychic functions, is their semiotically mediated nature. Higher psychic functions include in their structure as a central and main part of the whole process the utilization of a sign. Sign was often used synonymously with speech or language by Vygotsky. So higher psychic functions emerge when speech becomes part of the thought operations. Fundamentally, reorganization of psyche takes place together with the emergence of higher psychic functions. Perhaps the most important change that emerges together with higher psychic functions is the potential of humans, as this potential can emerge only in the cultural environment, and so far only humans have developed culture as defined in this paper. To realize that a world not available for senses exists, and after realizing that, to develop knowledge about the non-sensory world. A full potential of making sense or knowing the world cannot be realized in one step together with the emergence of higher psychic functions. This is so because, and a Vygotsky quote, each method of cultural behavior consists, as it is shown, by the analysis of natural psychological processes. Yet that method unites them not in a mechanical but in a structural way. That structure does not remain unchanged. That is the most important of all we know concerning the cultural development of the child. After the structure comes into being, it does not remain unchanged, but is subject to a lengthy internal change which shows all the signs of development. Obviously, it is something that develops, not some abstract principle or undefined mind in general. If psyche is about knowing the world, then the development of it must be reflected in the ways that the emerging knowledge is organized. It was Vygotsky who gave, in my opinion, convincing justification that the idea that cultural development of the psyche is reflected in word meaning. He concluded, consciousness reflects itself in a word. Consciousness reflects itself in a word as the sun in a small drop of water. The word is related to consciousness as a small world is related to a big world. As a living cell is related to an organism, as an atom is related to the cosmos. The word is the small world of consciousness. The meaningful word is a microcosm of human consciousness. As an aside, very beautifully poetic, and I have managed to lose my page. Sorry about that. So a word, a communicative form with a meaning, is a phenomena that reflects properties of the psyche as a whole. Furthermore, a word connects external form with internal meaning, being in this way both external speech and psyche. Word connects internal and external also in another important way. We found the unit that reflects in the simplest way the unity of thinking and speech in the meaning of the word. From the psychological perspective, however, word meaning is nothing else but generalization. That is a concept. Generalization and word meaning are essentially synonyms. Any generalization, any form of a concept, is the most specific, most genuine, most unquestionable act of thought. Therefore, it is correct to understand word meaning as a phenomena of thinking. Here it is important to know what Vygotsky meant by thinking. According to him, thinking, internal organization of more complex forms of experience, thought appears in the role of the preparatory organizer of our behavior. Language, the main force that realizes our thinking as a system of internal organization of experience. Taken together, thus a word being a result of sense-making of the world, i.e. thinking reflects qualities of a psyche as a whole. Word meaning, however, does not remain unchanged. It develops. The largest part of Vygotsky's work was dedicated to the study of development, especially the development of word meaning, and psychic consequences of that development, both in children and in cultures. Next, it is important to define in which sense a word develops. Some Vygotsky observations are relevant here. In his essays on the history of behavior, he compared less developed primitive man with more developed cultural man, and observed, In the area of speech and thinking, a primitive man differs from a cultural man not only by the fact that his language turns out to be poorer in means, crude and less developed than the language of the cultural man. All this naturally is so, but at the same time, the language of primitive man impresses us exactly with the tremendous wealth of the vocabulary. The primitive man does not have concepts, abstract generic names are completely alien to him. He uses a word in another way than we do. Vygotsky thus distinguishes clearly quantitative aspect of psyche, the size of the vocabulary, from the qualitative aspect, the way and how the words are used. His theory of the stages of psychic development is exactly a theory of the development of the way a word is used, of the word meaning structure, following Vygotsky's theory. It can be said that the Great Divide is exactly here. Cultures and individuals can be developmentally ordered according to the stage of psychic development, the stage of word meaning structure development achieved by a culture. The stages of word meaning development. In most of his works, Vygotsky distinguished three stages of word meaning development: syncretic concepts, complexes or everyday concepts, and scientific concepts. In some works, however, the fourth stage, that of true concepts, was added after the stage of scientific concepts. That stage emerges later, around puberty, and also has a different structure. Vygotsky provided many characteristics of different kinds of concepts and demonstrated how psyche and behavior change in the course of the individual and cultural development. Yet there are also many imperfections in his theory. It is especially true about the theory of word meaning structure and its development. Vygotsky did not provide descriptions of the structures of the word meanings at different stages. There are no elements and their relationship systematically described at each stage. There is also no understanding of what exactly changes in the word meaning structure with the emergence of a new stage and what grounds emergence of a new stage. When such aspects are added to his theory, then more complex picture emerges. Instead of 3 or 4 stages, 5 stages of word meaning structure development can be distinguished. Also, psychic behavioral differences that characterize different stages of word meaning development can be much better understood, and many more differences can be hypothesized. The 5 stages of word meaning development I described first 15 years ago. There I also showed how drawing far too often, considering to be nonverbal process, is clearly verbally mediated, and how stages of word meaning structure development ground stages of drawing development. The fully developed structural systematic theory of the stages of psychic development, together with ample empirical evidence that it is in full agreement with the theory, was published recently. Here I will give you only a very short summary of the stages of psychic development. When appropriate, I have kept Vygotsky's terms. A basic element of psyche, sensory attribute. Structural systemic theory must answer the question, what is the basic element of the thing or the phenomena that is aimed to understood? This applies also to psyche. Psyche, as I have defined above, is a special form of the way of living organisms relates to its environment. The relationship is based on individual experience. The potential for the emergence and development of psyche must be based on biotic mechanism. Therefore, the basic elements of psyche must be a biotic phenomenon. I suggest that psyche emerges only on the basis of sensory experiences. The sensory process end up with the sensory attributes, modal, specific aspects of the experienced reality. In vision, for instance, the sensory system distinguishes visual experience into the following attributes: contour, color, orientation, depth, and movement. Other sensory organs provide analogous different sensory attributes in respective modalities. So the basic element of psyche is a sensory attribute. All psychic content is constructed from sensory attributes in a specific relationship. Psyche is about environment, So, which sensory attributes and in which relationships are going to be synthesized into a sign are determined by the structure of the environment, but not any sensed environmental regularity is going to develop into a sign. What becomes a sign is equally determined by the organism, by its needs and its earlier experiences stored in memory. In other words, a sign emerges in the organism environment unity. Sign development is in principle hierarchical. Each new stage, a new type of sign with a novel structure cannot develop immediately from birth. There are two constraints on sign development. First, sign development is hierarchical. A more complex sign can emerge only when the earlier stage has been constructed. And second, psychic development is constrained by brain maturation. So there is an age before which a certain type of sign cannot develop in principle. When that age is achieved, actually when the certain state of brain maturation is achieved, there is an inter-individual variability when exactly a new stage becomes possible. The new stage becomes biologically possible. Whether this developmental potential is realized depends on whether the earlier stages of signs have been developed and on whether the environment is organized in a way that grounds the development of more complex sign types. For instance, a biological human child will never develop linguistic signs unless there is a social speech environment in which the child can interact. More complex forms of thought can develop in more complex forms of environment, formal schooling or developmental environment where similar concept complexity is created, for instance, is necessary for the development of logical concepts. Sensory-based stages of development. The development of psyche begins on the basis of the senses. Sorry, just having a moment. The development of psyche begins on the basis of the senses. The sensory based mind emerges. The first stage of associative signs begins with birth. Children learn that certain sensory attributes appear together so that novel aspects of the world can be predicted on the basis of experiences. At this stage, any patterns of sensory attributes become a sign if it is correspondingly meaningful for the organism or for the organism organization of the environment. Similarly, with Pavlov's dog, a child can learn that certain sound predicts appearance or disappearance of food, mother, or whatever other important thing in the child's world. Yet the sound does not have to characterize a mother, for instance. It can be a sound of an opening door or a father's voice greeting a mother, etc. At this stage, there are no objects yet in the child's psychic world. Correspondingly, the child's activities are all still the same inborn patterns of actions, but now it becomes possible to use these actions in novel conditions. Such actions are often called conditioned reflexes. Around the age of 5 to 6 months, object signs begin to emerge. A child discovers that certain patterns of sensory attributes remain together even when he manipulates the world. This way, objects are differentiated from the ground. Correspondingly, object-oriented novel forms of action become possible. For instance, a child begins to reach towards objects and take them. While using objects, these become like extensions of the body. So first forms of tool making and use emerge at this stage. From about 9 to 10 months, the development of the situation signs becomes possible. While manipulating with objects, a child discovers that one object can be affected by the other. In situation, sign relationship between objects are represented. A child begins to understand situations, dynamic systems of relationship between things in his/her world. Construction of complex tools becomes possible. Situations of things can be created purposefully for achieving child's aims. The emergence of semiotically mediated psyche, emergence of concepts. The stage of situation signs allows in principle to understand all the world available for senses. Social relationships based on sensory-based signs becomes possible. A child may learn to react to his or her name, look for named things, etc. Yet the medium of such social relationship is not language in the human sense. Social situated sign must have three characteristics. First, it must be something that can be sensed, otherwise it could not be used for communication. Second, there must be a signifier, an object that refers to something else, the signified. And third, the relation between signified and signifier is arbitrary. It is a novel relationship between sensory-based situation signs that ground the communication. Human language has one further characteristic that grounds specifically humankind of thought. Only humans can use the signifier differently from the way the signified can be used. If an identical for sensory-based thought thing can be called with two or more different words, then signify different things in communication, it becomes possible to discover that something identical for senses, things that can be different in non-sensory qualities and vice versa. It becomes also possible to realize that different for senses things may have important non-sensory similarities. In this way, humans have discovered that the world is more than can be sensed. Even more, humans have discovered and are discovering novel knowledge about that non-sensory world is organized. All such discoveries become possible when social situational signs develop into linguistic concepts. Notice that my definition of concept is close to Vygotsky's and different from that used in the Anglo-American mainstream psychology. Thinking with concepts grounds entirely novel way of making sense of the world. Stages of word meaning, structural development, stages of concept development. From about the age of 1 year, first linguistic signs, syncretic concepts begin to develop. A child uses syncretic concepts, first words. I remind word is understood in this paper as any communicative form with meaning, so it can also be a gesture, picture, etc. One at a time. Syncretic concepts are signified holistic units where no organization of the signifiers can be created, because that would require comparison of the signifiers. Correspondingly, there is no systemic relationship between the signifier and the signified. The same word may signify a thing in one communicative context, a situation in the other, and a property in the third. Using Vygotsky's expression, a word signifies a place in a situation. So there are no clear categories signified by the words. Perhaps it is worth mentioning that syncretic concepts are still not totally disorganized. Their use is strongly constrained by the social others. These need to understand what is signified by the word used. So there is always a certain reason why a word is used to signify something. The other can understand the communicative intention if that other has participated in the process of the emergence of the word meaning. Use of syncretic concepts grounds already a specifically human way of thinking. When a word signifieds are changed, the child can discover similarities between these perceptually different signifieds and can develop novel categories of sensory-based signs. Next stage, that of object concepts, becomes possible around the age of 1.5 years. Now a child begins to use two words together. When two words are said about the same thing, then a possibility for differentiation of word classes emerges. First, in communication, it is necessary to define what is the subject and what is the message about. So one of the words begins to signify objects. As a rule, the object categories are defined by similarity in shape. Categories signified by object words, which are not grammatically nouns yet, are prototypical. The other word, not to be redundant, has to signify something else. It is the same property of the thing. Objects, concepts ground novel activities aimed at changing properties of the things. Third stage of word meaning development becomes possible around the age of 3 years. Everyday concepts emerge. Now limit on the number of words used together become considerably higher. So it becomes possible to describe situations. For this, at least 3 words, like subject, verb, object, must be used together. Grammar of a language differentiates. It becomes possible to describe all sensory-based words in language. Also, the ability to create stories about non-sensory world emerges. Fairy tales, religion, and all similar fantastic narrative emerges. Categories signified by words are exemplar based but still fuzzy boundaries. Everyday concepts ground complex planning of activities that extend over time and space, and allow to involve stages not available for senses, such as extracting metal from ores. Complex societies can be built with the division of labor and other societal roles. From about the age of 7, logical concepts may develop. Gotzi's called similar concepts with a confusing term scientific. Scientific concepts are not necessarily related to science. They can be even opposing to scientific knowledge in content. So I call them logical concepts because at this stage, purely intralinguistic categorization emerges that allows to create categories with absolute all or none boundaries. Logical thinking in Aristotelian sense is impossible without such categories. Thus, formal logic thought emerges at this stage. Logical thought is necessarily self-conscious, that is, metacognitive. Logical form of one's own thinking has to be differentiated from other non-logical forms of thought. Novel forms of activity emerge on the basis of logical concepts, as only logical thinking allows to make valid conclusions about the non-sensory world. Justified knowledge of non-sensory world emerges. Based on the knowledge of novel technologies can be created. Creation of these technologies is explicitly based on justified knowledge about the non-sensory world. All justified statements about the non-sensory world, understanding of which is the realm of science, are logical. All logical conclusions about the world, however, are not necessarily valid. Valid logical conclusions require necessarily valid premises. At this last stage of psychic development, which may begin to emerge after the age of puberty around 12 years, systemic or true concepts may develop. Only at this stage, premises or logical conclusions are consciously selected and thoroughly justified. Categories signified with systemic concepts are with all or none clear boundaries, but it is also understood that the same thing may belong to mutually exclusive categories depending on the context. For example, it can be understood that the Earth can be simultaneously flat and spherical. It is flat or hilly for our sensory experience, but spherical as a planet. The sphericity of the Earth cannot be perceived with senses. Similarly to the spherical shape of the moon cannot be seen neither by the naked eye nor by very best telescope. Yet the sphericity can be deduced to solve the conflict between many different observations about the Earth. There are no further stages of development because with systemic concepts, in principle, there is no psychic boundary to understand the universe anymore. It does not follow that everything about the universe can be known. Humans are limited in time, space, and the ability to manipulate with the matter. Absolute knowledge is still impossible. So increasingly complex understanding of the universe as a hierarchical, multi-level system emerges. This increasing complexity is taken into account in planning activities, such as planning industrial developments, taking into account climate changes, social structures, and all other relevant aspects of the situation. Stages of development are hierarchical. As it was discussed above, several scholars have assumed that different kinds of thinking that are based on different kinds of word meaning structure are not in a hierarchical relationship. Rather, it is assumed that these different forms of thinking just reflect difference in cultural practices. This assumption concerns, first of all, differences between everyday concepts and logical concepts. This assumption, however, is clearly wrong. Logical concepts require metacognition, thinking about one's own form of thinking. Such form of thinking cannot develop before thinking processes that are reflected upon. These are everyday concepts and other less developed forms of thought. Therefore, logical conceptual thinking is a more developed form of thought. The same applies for other stages of development. I distinguish each of them within the exception of the systemic concepts at the last stage of development is a necessary basis for the next stage to become possible in principle. On the other hand, each of them, with the exception of the biological basis, requires a preceding stage of psychic development to become possible. Important conclusions from this idea. First, it can be hypothesized that performance on many tests must be easier with more advanced forms of thinking because these allow to take into account more information and create more complex responses. Second, it is not only a question whether for the person a task is solvable in principle, the same task can be solved differently with different conceptual structures. For example, if there is a question whether it is right time to sow seeds in spring, both those thinking in everyday concepts and those thinking in logical concepts could answer the question. The answer may even be largely, but not fully, overlapping in those different cases. Yet the way how the question is answered would be very different. Estonian farmers knew that the right time for sowing has arrived when it was possible to sit comfortably on the ground with a naked bottom. That would be one of the everyday conceptual ways to answer the question about sowing time. Perhaps a phase of the moon or some other relevant fact would be taken into account. Today, the farmers thinking with logical concepts, or farmers who trust the scientists who think in this way, would not use this procedure. Instead, they would try to discover the relative characteristics of the soil, weather, and whatever else what can be important, and develop on the basis quite complex ways to decide the seeding times. Third, and perhaps most importantly, some tasks must be impossible to solve with less developed forms of thought. A farmer thinking with everyday concepts would not be able to even to realize that climate of the whole earth is changing. Predictably, for that farmer, there would be no climate change. Only the weather would become increasingly unpredictable. Logical and systemic concepts, however, allow not only to predict sowing dates, but also future sowing dates can be calculated considering climate change. Future sowing. I'm not going to get into it. Relationship between cultural ontogenesis and cultural phylogenesis. If the cultural environment is language-based and language emerges only intrapsychically, it has to be so. It has to be so because the signifier-signified relationship exists only intrapsychically, even though its relationship itself emerges only in social relationship. Then cultural and individual developments be in a certain perspective identical. Obviously, the similarity of the two developmental lines cannot be about the content of the cultural knowledge and practices. A child learns about ready-made from his or her perspective organization of his or her culture. When he has learned what has been created by earlier generations, novel forms of cultural organization that did not exist before can be created by individuals. So only the form of the cultural development, the structure of concepts cannot be different in two lines of development because emergence of novelty in both lines of development is based only on individual creativity. Culture as a collection of individuals cannot create anything novel as a whole. This conclusion emerges inevitably from another line of thought. Cultures and individuals exist in an asymmetric relationship. Individuals would survive without a culture, but culture cannot exist in principle without individuals. Furthermore, every single individual must develop from a living creature into a cultural being. This acculturation requires interaction with the cultured individuals. Culture would vanish immediately if one generation of children would not have cultured individuals around who constantly recreate cultural environment for them. At this point, I'm just going to say Nicaraguan Sign Language 1979, where a new language emerged on the playground of the individuals interacting. Also, the concept of the moving of a language from a pidgin to a Creole to a modern language and the cultural development that it would be associated with that calls into question that entire paragraph. That entire sentence. Culture would vanish immediately if one generation of children would not have cultured individuals who constantly recreate the cultural environment for them. No, the culture that was in existence would die out, but the new generation of children would instantly create a new culture and a new language, allowing them to communicate and to move forward. So it is, getting back to our reading, so it is possible to connect cultural and individual development into a whole. Culture develops only on the basis of individual creativity. Therefore, every next stage of development, as well as every next stage of within stage development, emerges on the basis of the development of individual members of a culture. In that sense, culture can be understood as an accumulation of individual created content over time. If individual development proceeds over a unilinear hierarchy of stages, then cultural cannot develop otherwise. Cultural development reflects the development of individuals. However, individual creativity and ability to create something novel is possible only when an individual has learned the cultural content that already exists. Therefore, the developmental potential of an individual is constrained by the level of cultural development. If a culture has achieved only very first stages of word meaning structure development, an individual can perhaps achieve a beginning of the next stage, not available in the cultural organization, but not more. This is because of the complexity of developmentally higher level knowledge and skills. Furthermore, individually created cultural content must become part of the cultural organized environments where next generations can learn what has been achieved. It means that other developed individuals must first learn the novel content, accept it, and only after these individual developments, a novel culture content can become continuous for next generations through organization of the development environment. As such, created environments among such created environments is formal schooling, which similarly to literacy and written speech has emerged on the basis of individual development that had to achieve logical conceptual stage of word meaning structure development. Formal schooling is the most widespread form of cultural environments where the logical conceptual thinking stage emerges and develops. Of course, it does not follow that this form of thinking cannot emerge in other settings, except you said that earlier in the paper. Similarly, structural environment can be organized even at home by parents, but such parents would not have much resources left for other activities outside teaching. Children spend usually more than half of their waking time in the school environment organized by teachers. In addition, teachers have to prepare for classes and educate themselves. Private teachers would also be sufficient for supporting child development, but it would be impossible for every child to have a private teacher. So institution of formal education is inevitable for any culture where development of thinking with logical concepts is supported. If an individual has not yet had opportunities to participate in cultural environments that support the development of logical concept thinking, their mentality, their way of thinking, even in adulthood, must be based on a less developed form of thought. Usually in the world today, that the thought can be developed to the level of everyday concepts in all known cultures. Thus, this is because everyday concepts develop in everyday settings with no necessity to organize developmental environment in a particular way to support the development of more advanced forms of thinking. If this theoretical idea is correct, then it becomes possible to study cultural development at the individual level. Studying children would not be sufficient because they lack not only more advanced forms of thought, but they also have not developed content, cultural knowledge, and skills to survive independently in the world of adults. The situation is different with adults who have the necessary skills and knowledge to cope with their world, but have not developed logical conceptual thinking. 1 hour and 9 minutes in. This is a group with no formal education and no other kind of support to the development of logical concepts. Adult illiterates who remained illiterate because of the lack of opportunity to attend school. It is worth mentioning here that there are also literates with no formal schooling. The Vai people studied by Scribner and Cole, for instance. Such situations are rare today. As a rule, people without formal education are also illiterate. In the following discussion, illiterate is meant to signify illiterate individuals with no formal education. Two different groups of adult illiterates must be distinguished according to a culture where they live. In a culture with no formal education system and no literacy, nobody has developed logical concepts. The cultural practice Let's be clear about this. In a culture with no formal education system and no literacy, nobody has developed logical concepts. Logical concepts are necessary for the formation of formal education. Therefore, in a culture which has no literacy and no formal education system, nobody can come up with the concept of formal education. Then how the hell did formal education emerge historically? And the get out of jail card that he will use at this point is the concept of the genius. And the concept of, oh, a genius level individual created it, managed to jump over this gap. And so we have that. And then he will hand wave it off and go, oh, but that's not really important. If a culture had no formal education system to start with and no literacy to start with, these things would not be recognized as or be prized enough for them to be adopted into the cultural norm. Therefore, the creation of a formal schooling environment that he expounds on so beautifully would not happen. Getting back to it, and I'm sorry for the aside, the situation is different in case of illiterates in cultures where formal education is present or even common. Brazil, for instance, is a country with millions of adult illiterates who live side by side with people with different levels of education, including university degrees obtained from universities that belong to the top 500 of the world. In such a culture, advanced forms of thinking and cultural practices based on it are available, in principle, to all members of that culture. But theoretically uneducated illiterates who rely on everyday conceptual structures should not be able to understand these more advanced forms of cultural organization. Studying adult illiterates in cultures where more advanced forms of thought are extensively applied in cultural practices would allow to understand the advances provided by logical and systemic concepts compared to everyday concepts. General hypotheses about these differences are put forward below after some other important ideas are discussed. The Great Divide, not so great, but still divide. The idea of stages in psychic development can be interpreted in different ways. Often it is assumed that the later emerging stage replaces the earlier form, and this change affects the psyche as a whole. This, however, is not correct. Thought is developmentally heterogeneous. It was observed, for example, by Vygotsky. Quote, however, this process of transition of different forms of thinking and different phases of development cannot be understood as a mechanical process, where each new phase arrives with the preceding phase is completely finished. Different genetic forms coexist. This thesis is not an exception, but rather a rule for the development of behavior as a whole. We know that human behavior is not consistently at one and the same higher level of its development. In the human behavior, the newest and youngest forms that emerged just recently in the history of humanity exist side by side with the most ancient. The same can be said about the development of the child's thinking. Also here, a child who has mastered the highest form of thinking and concepts does not part with the more elemental forms of thinking. Even an adult, as we noted earlier, not always thinks in concepts. Very often, the adult's thinking is accomplished at the level of complexes, sometimes descending to even more elementary, more primitive forms. End quote. Such heterogeneity of thought has been observed by several other scholars. From the principle of genetic heterogeneity of thought follows the idea that no culture can be organized on the basis of and no individual thinks with the most developed form of thought available in all situations. This is necessarily so if developmental hierarchy of thought is defined, as I do, in terms of the form of thought, the structure of thought operations. A form of thought necessarily requires content knowledge, ideas, information, that is thought of. If the content has not developed sufficiently in culture or has not been available for an individual in that content area, the thought has to rely on less developed form. The amount of knowledge available in culture is already long time far beyond abilities of any single individual to know. Thus, no developed individual can be homogeneous in thought operations in different content areas. If thought is heterogeneous, genetic, and not in terms of parallel forms, then only two possible states of thought can exist. In some cultures or individuals, only theoretically lower forms of thinking can be observed. In other individuals or cultures, developmentally more advanced forms of thought must exist in parallel with less developed forms. However, it must be impossible for the developed forms of thought to exist alone without theoretically lower forms of thought. Furthermore, if the development of the cultures or individuals is studied, then the theoretical order of emergence of more advanced forms of thought must be observed. For example, everyday concepts and logical concepts cannot emerge simultaneously in principle. Thousands of facts about child development are in full agreement with the idea that the development proceeds over a fixed hierarchy of stages, exactly as predicted by the theory. Consequence of emergence of logical concepts. To understand cultural and individual differences in the world today, first of all, differences between everyday and logical conceptual thought must be understood. This is so because all cultures today have developed to the level of everyday concepts, and many have developed to logical concepts. Some perhaps even begin to advance to systemic concepts. It is worth mentioning that earlier distinction between primitives or savages on one hand and civilized or modern people on the other can be understood also in the same everyday concept, logical concept, Great Divide dimension. I dare you to point to a single society in the world today that does not have access to logical concepts in its language formation. Any language that has moved beyond that of a pigeon has logical concepts built into it. It is the basis of all grammatical function. The differentiation between the object and the qualities of the object that you so carefully pointed out earlier. If you can point to one single society, one single culture that does not use logical concepts in its cultural norms, then I will buy your idea of the Grand Divide. But until you can successfully manage to point to one example, this is a waste of time and hot air. get back to what he was saying, yet the explanation of the difference is not the same. I am proposing a theory that explains the conceptual difference from a perspective of the differences in mental operations, not on the basis of descriptions of external activities or behaviors as it was often done before. So, for example, in discussions of cultural differences, literacy is not by itself a psychological phenomena, but rather a statement of the fact that literacy is present in some cultural groups and absent in others. The same applies to explanations that attribute cultural differences to cultural practices. This, again, is just a dimension of behavioral patterns. In all cases when cultural similarities or differences are concluded on the basis of apparent differences or similarities in patterns of activities, the most important aspect of human functioning, the psychic processes, are not sufficiently taken into account. The main problem in approaches based on such superficial behavioral characteristics is that externally identical behaviors may rely on psychically different mental mechanisms and vice versa. I bring just one example. People have different attitudes and opinions about climate change today. Some believe that climate is changing and the earth is warming due to human activity. Others believe that climate is changing, but the change is not related to human activity. Many people also do not believe that climate change is changing at all. Religiosity, purely a realm of everyday conceptual thought, is related to beliefs in climate change in an interesting way. There are those who believe that nothing happens without God's will. Therefore, even if climate changes, there is nothing humans should do. The others, in turn, believe that the earth has been given to humans who should manage it responsibly. Thus, humans should actively take measures against climate change. On the other hand, there are non-religious people who also believe or do not believe in human contribution to climate change. And your point is? Obviously, the reason why religious and non-religious people do or do not believe in human contribution to climate change are different. Even though behaviors of believers in climate change can be similar, as well as are similar behaviors of religious and non-believers, the psychological mechanism underlying the behaviors can be very different. Both everyday conceptual religious thought and science-based logical conceptual thought can underlie externally similar beliefs and corresponding behaviors. Yet the true psychological relation of different individuals to their environment are different. Whoop-de-doo. Why logical conceptual thought is more efficient. As I provided arguments to support the idea that logical concepts cannot develop before or at the same time with everyday concepts, even if it is so, it does not necessarily follow that the later developing form of thought is also more efficient, better when compared to the earlier form. In that case, also no culture can be more developed than the other. They are just qualitatively different at the same levels of development. So where is our divide? Perhaps the main argument against the idea that thinking with logical concepts can be more efficient than thinking with everyday concepts comes from observations that the ability thought to be absent in individuals with supposed lower level of development actually often can be discovered in the right contextual conditions. This conclusion, however, is simply wrong. For example, it has been found that non-literate persons are able to solve only syllogisms that are connected with their everyday activities. So it is concluded these individuals have an ability to solve syllogisms. This result, however, does not demonstrate that this is the same ability. Actually, two different abilities are involved here. One is an ability to solve verbal problems with formal logical structure, such as syllogisms. The other is an ability to solve some problems of everyday life presented verbally. Contextually Contextually different explicitly demonstrates hierarchy and higher efficiency of logical concepts. Those thinking in logical concepts can solve all syllogisms independently of context, whereas the everyday conceptual thought allows to solve only a limited set of problems. If to consistently follow such arguments against hierarchy, we should also attribute the same numerical abilities to the most advanced human mathematicians and honeybees, because honeybees have the same numerical abilities. Only in honeybees these can be revealed in specific contexts. The same abilities are not the same also according to neuropsychological studies. Different brain regions are involved in solving the same task depending on whether a person is illiterate or formally educated. So both efficiency of problem solving and cognitive structure of the psychic process underlying it change with formal education. That grounds the development of logical concepts. Emergence of logical concepts grounds more efficient psyche anyway. Even if to assume the logical conceptual thoughts is not more efficient as such, it is clearly a different way to organize thought. So those who have developed logical concepts have more different ways to solve problems compared to those who have achieved only everyday concepts. It is impossible to have logical concepts without everyday concepts. Logical concepts, however, are more powerful. They allow the solving of problems to solve all the problems solvable with everyday concepts, but in addition, allow to solve problems that cannot be solved with everyday concepts. All modern science is based on logical concepts. Only logic and systemic concepts allow to arrive at valid and reliable knowledge about the world that is not available for senses. No such knowledge can be achieved with everyday concepts. The way hypothesis for the study. Oh, thank God, we're almost finished. Now, this might just be me splitting hairs, but it's normally, in my experience, normally hypotheses should be stated before going into a long diatribe, but you know. Hypotheses for the study. The way psyche is organized, what kind of concepts can be constructed, must be a characteristic of the psyche as a whole. Okay. Vygotsky and his followers, Lura in the first place, studied mostly cognitive processes such as memory, thinking, perception, and self-awareness. Cognitive achievements include performance on nonverbal tests related to the use of logical concepts, have been supported by later studies as well. However, it is not only cognition in this restricted sense that is organized differently according to the type of sign or concept constructed. The level of conceptual development must characterize psyche in all its aspects. In addition to cognition, also values, attitudes, personality, the psyche as a whole in all its aspects must be different. I am not aware of any studies that would have aimed to reveal relationship between conceptual development and the mentality, the psyche in wide range of its aspects. So the psychic worlds of people relying on developmentally different levels of concepts must be profoundly different. There is some evidence to support this hypothesis. For example, statistical structure of personality test performance varies systemically with the dominant type of word meaning system, everyday conceptual versus logical conceptual. No consistent Big Five structure emerges in a group of people with predominantly everyday conceptual thought. Word meaning structure level is also related to depression. Even more, changes in the depression level can be predicted better with psychological variables. The the Big Five personality test, self-esteem, coping style, aggressiveness, in a group with a high level of logical conceptual answers in the word meaning structure test as compared to a group providing predominantly everyday conceptual answers. Furthermore, word meaning structure is related to the level of parents' educational cognitive ability, personality dimensions, collectivism, coping style, aggression, attitudes towards narcotics, and self-esteem. This evidence for the relationship between word meaning structure and non-cognitive psychological characteristics, however, is flawed. In the cited studies, quantitative group-level results are provided. The evidence in these publications is sufficient to demonstrate the dominant type of word meaning structure is related to the mathematical structure of the individual differences data analyzed at group level. Such data, independently of whether the word meaning structure is taken into account or not, cannot characterize psyche, which is an individual phenomena. This is so because it is in principle impossible to discover the structure of the individual mind not only by studying inter-individual variability, but actually by using any quantitative, mathematically variable-based methods of data analysis. So other kinds of evidence is needed to support or reject the following hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, psyche develops over hierarchical stages. Number 2, every next stage is more developed, allows to understand the world better, at least because of possibility of different ways of representing and comprehending the world. Number 3, psychic ontogenious recapitulates psychic phylogenesis in form, in the basic structure of signs and concepts, but not in concept. Number 4, therefore, in cultures where the development of more advanced forms of thought is supported, with a system of formal schooling, for instance, adults who have not had an opportunity to participate in such support systems must rely on less developed forms of thought, which is similar to all children and adolescents who have not achieved the highest developmental levels of support by the cultural organizing activities. Even though the form of thought must be similar, the content must be different. It is possible to be more specific with the hypotheses. Everyday conceptual thought compared to logical conceptual thought must be A, less coherent, more fragmented and contradictory. B, occasionally less efficient for solving problems and occasionally insufficient to solve a problem at all. And C, relying on everyday knowledge that can be directly constructed on the basis of sensory experience. No justified valid knowledge about non-sensory world can be coherently applied in solving problems and explaining things and phenomena of the world. These characteristics must be pervasive. They must apply to all aspects of the psychic world of a person, not only to solving strictly cognitive problems, but to understanding the world in its complexity, to knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, values, to personality as a whole. To test these interrelated hypotheses, only qualitative methodology would be appropriate. Shocking. This methodology, however, must also be different from what I have called the modern qualitative approach. This approach is not suitable for testing specific hypotheses and revealing structure of psyche in general, or the structure of concepts in particular. The main limitation of this approach, but not the only one, is rejection of methods that constrain research situation, creation of so-called artificial conditions or constraints on the study situation. This paper does not allow space to discuss all relevant methodological issues in detail, so I provide just a list of general theses about the methodological principles discussed elsewhere. 1. Methods must be qualitative. 2. All studies must be theory-guided. Theory must be articulated at different levels of analysis, beginning with the unifying theory of psychology that proposes how different aspects of mind and therefore different branches of psychology are connected. Theory must be explicit, that makes it possible to be constantly questioned at all levels, beginning from epistemology and ontology to the specific theories of studied things and phenomena. Methods must include observation in natural settings, observations in artificially constrained settings, analytical experiments where qualitatively different structures and elements of structures are identified, and constructive experiments where attempts are made to construct the studied phenomena or things. 5. All methods must be developmental, i.e. the results of the studies must be possible to interpret in terms of development. One that I am going to add, study must be falsifiable. You must have a null hypothesis because as the discussion above revealed, part of the methodological requirements for studying conceptual development are already fulfilled. It is decided that methods of study must be qualitative. Important aspects of the unifying theory of psyche are formulated. Epistemological and ontological ground, structural systemic theory, is explicitly formulated so that the results of the studies can be appropriately questioned. Next step is to select methods to allow to begin with the testing of the hypotheses and conduct studies. Such studies are going to be reported in the following papers. That was Tom Lay's. Let me go back up to the title. Studies in the Mentality of Literates, Searching for the Great Cultural Divide at the Individual Level of Analysis. Published online 23rd of October 2019. Quite a bit to unpack there. Quite a bit to unpack there, and I will leave it there for the time being.